We all talk about getting to 100% renewable energy. It's the big promise for tackling climate change. But how do you actually build a system like that? One that works reliably, affordably, when your main power sources, the wind and the sun, are, well, fundamentally unpredictable.
That's the multi-million dollar question, isn't it? Or multi-million euro in this case.
Exactly. And traditionally, the way engineers and planners have tackled this is, frankly, a bit surprising. They often rely on just one historical year of weather data.
Right. They might pick, say, 2016, look at every hour of wind and sun that year, and optimize the entire grid design based only on that.
Which sounds risky. If that year happened to be unusually calm or unusually sunny.
It introduces a massive, often hidden economic risk. And that's precisely what the research we're looking at today digs into. It doesn't just flag the risk, it actually quantifies how fragile these standard design methods can be.
So, our mission today is a deep dive into this specific study on the impact of probabilistic weather data on the economic design of renewable energy systems, a case study on La Gomera Island. We want to figure out what happens when you stop planning based on one slice of the past and start preparing for, well, thousands of possible futures.
It really is a fundamental shift in thinking.
Hmm.
We absolutely have to move beyond optimizing for a single, maybe convenient historical year. The goal needs to be designing for robustness. You need systems that can handle the unexpected, the extremes, not just the average conditions of one specific year.
And islands you mentioned are key here. Why are they such good places to test these ideas?
Islands are fantastic test beds. Their isolation makes them vulnerable, yes, but it also forces innovation. They have to be technically self-reliant. We've seen pioneers already, places like El Hierro, also in the Canaries, or Graciosa, Samso in Denmark. They're showing that 100% renewable is achievable on an island scale.
Okay, let's unpack that need for robustness. On an island aiming for 100% renewables, you can't just put up panels and turbines. You've got to deal with those fluctuations. The wind dying down, clouds rolling in.
Absolutely. And that's where energy storage becomes, well, this study calls it indispensable. You simply cannot run a 100% renewable system without significant storage.
But it's not just about big batteries for electricity, is it?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
The key concept here is the smart energy system. It involves what's called sector coupling, linking power, heat, and transport. So if you have surplus wind power, maybe you don't just charge a central battery, maybe you use it to make hydrogen fuel or charge electric vehicles or power heat pumps for buildings. You have to use all the available ways to store or use that energy to smooth things out.
Right, makes sense. Don't let that valuable energy go to waste just because one storage option is full.
So what was missing before this particular study came along? What gap did it aim to fill? Well, people had looked at things like using finer time resolution, say 10-minute data versus hourly. And there's some initial attempts at probabilistic modeling, but this study really focused on the impact of stochastic, basically random, but statistically realistic weather and demand data on the overall robustness of different 100% renewable designs for a medium-sized island. They wanted to see how sensitive these whole system designs were, specifically to variations in wind, sun, and interestingly, even traffic patterns for electric vehicles.
Okay, so they needed a real-world laboratory, and they picked La Gomera in the Canary Islands. Tell us about it.
Precisely. La Gomera has around 22,000 residents. Back in 2016, its electricity demand was about 71 gigawatt hours. And crucially, like many islands, its power currently comes entirely from a diesel plant. So the goal set in this study was ambitious. Design 3 distinct viable ways for La Gomera to hit 100% renewables by 2030, completely ditching fossil fuels.
3 different blueprints for fossil-free future, but presumably using different technologies.
Exactly. 3 technologically different optimized scenarios. The first one they called Scenario 2030 H2. The H2 stands for hydrogen. This design really leaned into power to hydrogen, using electrolyzers to split water and create hydrogen gas for storage when there was surplus energy. And importantly, wind power was chosen as the main renewable source for this scenario.
Okay, so H2 is wind-heavy, using hydrogen for storage. What was the second option?
The second was Scenario 2030 V2G, that's vehicle to grid. Here, the focus shifted completely. The main storage solution was battery electric vehicles, cars plugged in and potentially feeding power back to the grid. They factored in a pretty substantial VDG capacity, nearly 200 megawatt hours. And for this one, solar PV was the dominant renewable source.
Interesting contrast. Wind paired with slower chemical storage like hydrogen, and solar paired with faster electrochemical storage in car batteries. Was that deliberate?
Oh, absolutely deliberate.
Mm.
They were specifically setting up a comparison. How would a wind-dominant system versus a solar-dominant system, each with its characteristic storage partner, cope with weather variability?
Right. And the third scenario?
The third was scenario 2030 Combi. Just like it sounds, it combined both hydrogen storage and V2G participation from electric vehicles. This one was also solar PV dominant, like the V2G scenario. And because it was balancing multiple storage types, it naturally ended up needing the highest total installed renewable capacity, over 62 megawatts of solar PV plus some wind.
Okay, so we have these three optimized designs, all achieve 100% renewables on paper. Now comes the stress test, moving beyond that single reference year assumption. How do they do that?
This is where the methodology gets really interesting and quite innovative for this kind of planning. They used a simulation tool called Energy Plan. It's pretty standard for this work and needs hourly data inputs. But first, they demonstrated why the old method is flawed. They did baseline runs using 3 different actual historical years: 2013, 2015, and 2016.
Hold on, just switching between those real years. What difference did that make?
Even that basic step showed significant variance. For the Combi scenario, for instance, just swapping the reference year from 2013 data to 2016 data changed the calculated annual system costs by up to 3.6%.
3.6%. That might not sound enormous, but we're talking millions of euros here, right?
Exactly. It was the difference between roughly 10.9 million euros and 11.3 million euros in annual costs. That's nearly 400,000 euros difference just based on which historical year you picked. The study puts it very clearly. The choice of one historical reference year is not suitable to determine the expected performance of an energy system.
Why is that 400K swing such a big deal for an island grid?
Because on smaller, isolated grids, the financing is often much tighter. The margins are thinner, the ability to absorb unexpected cost overruns is lower compared to a huge continental grid. A 3.6% variance can genuinely impact whether a project is seen as financially viable or not. It affects loan terms, investor confidence. It means the system you thought looked good based on 2013 weather might actually be operating at an unexpected loss if 2016 weather patterns occur more frequently. You need to understand that potential range, not just the average.
That really sets the stage for the main event, the probabilistic modeling. How do you simulate weather that hasn't happened yet?
They used Monte Carlo simulation principles. Instead of just replaying history, they generated synthetic time series data, basically, artificial, statistically realistic future weather patterns. They focused on the most critical variables: wind speed, solar irradiance, and also traffic volume, because that affects the V2G scenario. They generated 100 unique, plausible year-long data sets for each of these variables.
Okay, Monte Carlo generating lots of possibilities. You mentioned technical terms like first-order Markov chains for wind and probabilistic density functions for solar. Can you break that down a bit? Why not just use, like, a random number generator?
Good question. You can't just use pure random numbers because weather isn't truly random from hour to hour. It has persistence. A first-order Markov chain for wind speed essentially makes sure the sequence is realistic. If it's very windy this hour, it's much more likely to still be windy next hour rather than suddenly dropping to zero. The model captures that hour-to-hour correlation.
Okay, so it preserves the realistic flow of weather.
Exactly. And similarly, the probabilistic density functions for solar irradiance ensure the generated data reflects the actual distribution of sunlight intensity seen on Gomera. It's not just generating random sunny or cloudy hours. It generates realistic sequences, maybe several cloudy days in a row, followed by bright sunshine based on the island's known climate patterns. It makes the simulations much more true to life.
That feels crucial. You're testing how the system handles sustained periods of low wind or sun, not just isolated blips. So they ran these 100 synthetic futures for wind, solar, and traffic across the 3 different system designs. What did this massive simulation effort reveal?
Well, first, some confirmation. The Combi scenario, the one blending solar, V2G, and hydrogen, consistently came out as the economic winner. It generally had the lowest annual cost across the board. But here's where it gets really fascinating comparing the robustness. How much did the cost fluctuate in those 100 runs? The Combi scenario and the V2G only scenario showed pretty similar and relatively low uncertainty. Their standard deviation in annual cost was around 180,000 to 200,000 euros, so fairly stable economically speaking.
Okay, so the solar dominant systems were quite robust, but the wind-heavy one, the H2 scenario, let me guess.
Big difference. The H2 scenario, heavily reliant on wind, showed significantly higher variance. Its standard deviation for annual costs jumped up to nearly 269,000 euros when facing those probabilistic wind inputs. Much less robust.
Wow, so is the takeaway that wind power itself is just too risky for islands? Or is it more complicated?
It's more nuanced than that. The study points strongly to the combination of factors in that H2 scenario. Yes, wind is inherently more variable over longer periods than solar, But that scenario also relied heavily on electrolyzers for hydrogen production, which, in their base configuration, are relatively inflexible. They can't ramp up and down quite as rapidly as, say, batteries charging or discharging.
Ah, I see. So it's the volatile wind plus a less agile storage technology that creates the higher economic uncertainty.
That seems to be the core finding. The pairing matters. Small island systems that lean heavily on wind and use less flexible conversion technologies like basic electrolyzers appear much more sensitive to weather variations and therefore carry higher economic risk than systems primarily using solar paired with more responsive battery storage like V2G.
That's a really practical insight for designing future systems.
Okay, one more piece of the puzzle, the traffic volume for V2G. They modeled uncertainty there too, right? People plugging in at different times, driving off unexpectedly. Did that human randomness mess with the system costs?
Surprisingly, no. Across the 100 probabilistic runs varying traffic patterns, the study found it had no influence on the annual performance of the energy system in terms of overall cost.
Wait, really? Human behavior is usually seen as unpredictable. Why didn't that variability impact the bottom line?
The key seems to be the timescale and the role V2G played in these specific simulations. It was primarily modeled for annual balancing, absorbing surplus energy over days or weeks, not providing second-by-second grid stability. Over the course of a whole year, those hourly fluctuations in when cars were available just sort of averaged out. It suggests that for long-term energy balancing, V2G can be a very stable and predictable resource, even with individual driver unpredictability. That's actually huge news for V2G proponents. It implies you might not need hyper-complex models of driver behavior to make the economics work on an annual scale.
It certainly supports V2G as a potentially very positive stabilizing technology for these kinds of systems, at least for that annual balancing task.
Okay, so let's boil this down. If someone listening is involved in planning or funding these kinds of energy transitions, what's the single most important message from this La Gomera case study?
The absolute key takeaway is that the standard practice relying on a single historical year is insufficient. It might give you an average expected cost, but it completely hides the system's robustness, or lack thereof. It hides the potential variance, the economic risk. And for smaller, isolated grids like islands, understanding that variance is critical. You must use probabilistic inputs, these synthetic futures, to see not just the likely average outcome, but also the range of possibilities, including potentially costly worst-case scenarios.
So you need to know the mean and the potential deviation.
Precisely. And connecting this to the bigger picture, it underlines the need to invest not just in more storage, but in flexible storage and conversion technologies, ones that can adapt quickly to the inherent variability of renewables, especially wind. Managing that variance is key to de-risking the transition.
And the study points the way forward, too. Since the wind-heavy system with basic, inflexible electrolyzers showed high sensitivity.
Right, the researchers explicitly state that future work needs to analyze the performance of flexible electrolyzers. Systems that can ramp up and down more quickly might make wind-hydrogen pairings much more robust and economically stable, even with variable wind input.
It's not about less wind, it's about smarter, more adaptive technology to work with it. That feels like the cutting edge. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into on the impact of probabilistic weather data on the economic design of renewable energy systems, a case study on La Gomera Island. Thanks for joining us as we explored why looking beyond the average is so crucial for building a truly reliable and affordable 100% renewable future.